Welcome to Salam Islamic Center Islam and Science Series, Part 5, with Dr. Noah Aydin, The Age of Decline, Lessons from the History. Welcome, Dr. Aydin.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. So this is our last session on the series. And our topic for today, well, before that, let's recall what we talked about last time. So we talked about the legacy of the golden age of Islamic science, and we gave examples of specific contributions to Islamic civilization, to mathematics and other sciences. And we provided plenty of evidence against many of the claims and assumptions of the classical narrative based on research on primary sources, and most of that research was done in the second half of the 20th century, and we observed that unfortunately much of that research did not become common knowledge, and it usually does not show up in secondary sources, and it also doesn't is not included in school curriculum. So today's topic will be, what happened to the golden age? When did it end and why? And what lessons we can learn from the history? And what is our homework for today? What can we do to improve our situation for today? And we will also have a quiz at the end. Okay, so I hope you'll do well on this quiz. Okay, so I would like to start by this disclaimer that I don't claim to have the answer, the answer or the full answer to this question. And I would also like to caution you against people, who offer simple or simplistic explanations to explain this, big social phenomena. Okay, so there is usually a complex set of reasons behind such big social events, and they usually cannot be explained by a single event, by a single book or a single war. So nevertheless, based on evidence, we can say something about, this question of, what happened to the golden age and why it ended. Nevertheless, I don't think we have the full answers, and we should really be cautious about just accepting simplistic explanations on this question. Okay, if we recall, what classical narrative tells us about this question. So one explanation, so basically there are two main reasons according to the classical narrative. So one big reason, again, according to this narrative, is Imam Ghazali killed this golden age by his attack on philosophers in his book Tahafut al-Falasifa. And again, their understanding of science and religion is that there has to be a conflict between the two, and when religious orthodoxy is dominant, scientific activities diminish. So according to their view, Imam Ghazali represents the orthodox religious thought in the Islamic world. And again, this narrative looks at the Islamic civilization in religious and political terms. So this is definitely, this assumption is a reflection of their mentality, and they are bringing this European paradigm of conflict between religion and science. The other explanation they offer is the Mongol invasion of Baghdad in the middle of 13th century, and again, this classical narrative mindset looks at Islamic world mainly in political terms or religious terms, with little attention to intellectual history, and they definitely belittle the intellectual achievements of the Islamic world. So first we are going to see if these assumptions of classical narrative hold up against the actual evidence. Okay, so we are going to look at the evidence against these arguments. Well, we actually see, when we look at the primary source documents, we see that a lot of advanced scientific works were produced well after both of these events, after Al-Ghazali and also after Mongol invasion of Baghdad. So in fact, for some disciplines, for example, in astronomy, the golden age in the Islamic world was actually after Ghazali and Mongol invasion, between 13th and 16th centuries. And it is not just astronomy. We also find a lot of advanced scientific works in many other disciplines as well in the Islamic world between 13th and 16th centuries. So there are some interesting historical facts about Mongol invasion. So it turns out that a famous Muslim scholar was an advisor to Hulagu Khan, who invaded and destroyed Baghdad, and that was Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, the famous Tusi, whose work was directly used by Copernicus, and he was wise enough to save a lot of books from Baghdad, and he also convinced that the same ruler who destroyed Baghdad to build an observatory in Maraga the very next year, which was the most advanced observatory of its time. It was the most advanced scientific institution, at least as observatory, up to that time. And we'll see that some very important works in astronomy was achieved by Maraga school. So that happened immediately following the destruction of Baghdad by Mongols. And again, based on his lifelong research in the history of astronomy in the Islamic world, Professor George Saliba concludes that golden age of astronomy in the Islamic world was between 13th and 16th centuries. And here is just a subset of some of the famous and important scholars, astronomers who did, important work in this field. So it goes all the way to the middle of the 16th century. And remember, the research in this field is highly incomplete. So most of these, basically all of these assumptions of classical narrative were based on lack of research. They were not based on actual research evidence. It was more of prejudice and ideological assumptions about the Muslim world. But when we look at the actual documents, primary source materials, we get a completely different picture. Okay, so again, one of the assumptions of the classical narrative is this idea of deadly struggle between science and religion. We already saw plenty of evidence against this idea. So we observed, if you recall from earlier sessions, that many of the scientists in the Islamic world were also religious authorities. So, in fact, some of them were more famous for their religious functions than their scientific reputations. And again, many of the scholars, based on their research on primary source materials, they say that this notion of, deadly conflict between religion and science just does not make sense for the Muslim world. And there is plenty of evidence against that idea. Okay. Well, and we also observed, so the classical narrative tells us that this golden age was a shorter period between 9 and 12 centuries. But the evidence, research evidence, suggests that it was a longer period, lasted into, more likely into 16th century, and also scientific activity started earlier in the Muslim world, like in 8th century. So it was a longer period from 8th to 16th centuries. Nevertheless, it came to an end, and we are definitely no longer in the golden age. So what happened? What happened, right? What happened to the golden age, and why did Islamic science decline? Well, first, let's note that decline is a relative term. What really happened was that the Europe advanced much more rapidly compared to not just the Islamic world, but to the rest of the world. So decline also means, stop being a producer of knowledge and start being a consumer of knowledge. So it is also true that after 16th century, Islamic world was more a consumer of scientific knowledge rather than producer. And so when did the age of decline start? Okay, so unlike the classical narrative telling us that it started in the 12th century, so other scholars, based on their research, suggest that it started in the 16th century. And they observe that in the beginning of 16th century, the Europe, Islamic world, and China were about at the same level in terms of scientific achievements. But when we look at, when we come to the 18th century, Europe was clearly ahead. So what happened, between those centuries, after the 16th century? So, well, so here, when it comes to accounting for the reasons for the decline, I think, so this is where opinions can vary, and we do not necessarily have the full answers to this question. So nevertheless, there are some explanations offered by researchers. So here is what Professor Saliba suggests. So there were internal and external reasons. So in terms of internal reasons, there was a large-scale split of political power in the Islamic world by the middle of 16th century. So there were three major empires in the Islamic world. So Ottomans in the west, in the middle of the 16th century, Safavids in the middle, and Mughals in the east. And of course, there was competition and rivalry and wars between them, which weakened the Islamic world. And I think we can add more reasons to this, and I will talk about that in a few minutes. And there was also external reasons, starting like with the late 15th century into the 16th century. Europeans made great discoveries in terms of finding new routes to Far East. And so, the age of discovery opened a lot of new routes and opportunities for Europeans, and they gained a lot of economic resources as a result of shift in the trade routes. And they discovered a lot of new lands which offered a lot of natural resources like gold and silver and a lot of other natural sources, as well as free human labor in the form of slaves. And they were able to fund scientific research with this newly found enormous amount of wealth. And for the first time in history, we see the rise of royal academies in 16th and 17th centuries. And a new model of scientific enterprise began to take place in Europe, which never happened before. And that model continues to feed the scientific progress in the Western world. So again, so this is the political situation in the Muslim world in the middle of 16th century. Three major powers ruling the Islamic world: Ottomans in the west, Safavids in the middle, and Mughals in the east. And definitely there was rivalry between them. And so look at the trade routes before the age of discovery. So most of these trade routes were crisscrossing the Muslim world, and of course trade brings wealth, and and that is very important for progress in overall progress in a society. And scientific progress is very much tied to the economic situation in a society as well. So Muslim world definitely benefited the economic advantage that it had by sitting in the middle of the trade routes between Europe and the Far East. And however, after those geographic discoveries, Europeans circumnavigated the Muslim world. You see, the Muslim world was sitting right in the middle between Europe and the Far East, but then they started to go around the Muslim world as opposed to going through it, and this was a major disadvantage to the Muslim world, and it lost a lot of economic initiative and benefits of these trades. At the same time, Europeans discovered a lot of new lands, enormous amount of new lands and colonies, and they brought much wealth to their lands from these faraway places in terms of natural sources and human labor. So that was a major shift in economic and political situation that changed the balance between Europe and the rest of the world. And it is worth remembering here that Europeans, before they made these discoveries, they learned a lot of science from the Muslim world, including knowledge that was needed for navigation. Remember, Muslim world made a lot of progress in astronomy and geography and map making and navigational tools, and Europeans benefited enormously from that knowledge that enabled them to make these discoveries. And at the end of the day, that gave Europeans a lot of advantage. And this institution of royal academies came into being after these discoveries and the wealth that resulted from from the newly found resources as a result. So, so these royal academies gathered the most educated people, scholars, and freed them from financial worries. And these scholars produced new knowledge, and Europeans were good at converting the scientific knowledge to wealth in terms of new technology and tools, and they use that new technology and the tools to produce more wealth, and with more wealth they produce more scientific activity. So they created this cycle of wealth and scientific activities. So that was something new in the world history. So they created this systematic and sustained model to produce more science and more technology, and which in turn produce more wealth and so forth. So, and this cycle actually continues to this date. So with this model now, the purpose of science is not just pure knowledge, but it became a tool to produce more wealth. And so now, perhaps as the first time in history, science was organized as a business, right? A new business model. And the idea of patent also was born during this period. The birth of patents, modern patent idea is considered to be to start in Venice in 1474. And we have, and so the idea of, so knowledge now became monopolized, and it became an important source of creating wealth. And this idea, this model still continues into modern day, right? So big corporations, many of them have research and development divisions, and they invest in those divisions. Is it for the sake of pure science? Well, maybe a little bit, but the main reason, for those corporations investing in research and development is to create new technology to make more money, right? And so that cycle, that business model continues into modern world. And of course, competition among scientists is an important part of the model, right? So modern scientists all continuously compete for grant money, whether from government or private corporations, and there is this continuous competition to produce more science and more technology, and at the end of the day, those produce more money and more profit. So perhaps we did not have time to talk about this, but something similar happened actually in early Islamic civilization. Behind it was the competition among scholars was actually one of the reasons behind the remarkable rise of scientific activities in the Islamic world, because it was one of the ways to obtain positions, high positions in government, to prove that you have the most advanced knowledge of the time. So now in the Western world, there is a more systematic and sustained model of competition and the relationship between scientific knowledge and creation of wealth. So that new model, came into being in Europe in maybe 17th century. And of course, so after the Age of Discovery, Europeans colonized much of the world, including much of the Muslim world, and that definitely did not help they were already ahead, and with colonization, the rest of the world fell further behind. And in the last, in modern times, there is a continuous brain drain from the rest of the world to the Western world, which definitely does not help to change the balance. And, Islamic world and really the rest of the world did not really manage to create this capital-driven cycle to support scientific research. And Islamic world did have scientific institutions like Dar al-Hikmah, remember, or Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, observatory, and hospitals. They did have these scientific institutions, but making money was never their goal. It was never their goal. But the Western model created this sustainable model of relationship between wealth and scientific research. So as a result, the European model turned out to be more sustainable and hard to compete with. Now, we have these internal and external reasons to explain the age of decline. And according to Professor Saliba, external causes seem to be more prominent. So, however, I would like to talk about additional internal causes, and I would like to argue that maybe those internal causes played a larger role. So we can actually see in later periods of the Islamic civilization, they actually lost the initial urge to pursue scientific knowledge with enthusiasm. And we can see that the Islamic world, to a large extent, lost the mind and the spirit of critical thinking. And there was a reversal in attitude towards innovation and new knowledge and technology. And there was a sense of arrogance, which to some extent, which is in the human nature, right? So if you are superpower for a long time, it is in the human nature to develop a sense of arrogance, and instead of pursuing new ideas and innovations, maybe you are more interested in protecting power and status quo. And I think that did happen, along with external reasons that took place in Europe that we just talked about. And we can give some important specific examples in this regard. Early in the Islamic civilization, in 8th century, in the middle of 8th century, Muslims learned how to make paper from Chinese prisoners of war in the middle of 8th century. And that really helped. Paper was an important tool in spreading knowledge, right? And writing books. So definitely that helped the Muslim world to spread knowledge and, and produce more books that are more durable. And it definitely helped, creating large libraries and institutions of higher education. And they were eager to pursue this new technology and spread it around. Even though, you see, paper making was not a Muslim invention. However, they quickly adopted it, they realized its importance, and they spread it to the rest of the world. And Europeans learned how to make paper from Muslims, from the Muslim world. And later on, they started making better paper than Muslims. But when we came to the 15th and 16th centuries, there was a reversal in this attitude. By the 15th century, a printing press was invented in Europe. However, there was a big resistance in the Muslim world to adopt this new technology that would have helped tremendously to spread knowledge, right? Scientific or any kind of knowledge. So in fact, we see that in late 15th century, one of the Ottoman Sultan II banned printing press. You see, it banned printing press. I mean, we can discuss the reasons behind it, but whatever the reasons, look, this is a complete opposite attitude that Muslim world had 7 centuries earlier, And in the early 16th century, Selim I, who was Yavuz Sultan Selim, who was one of the most famous and strongest of Ottoman sultans, he reinforced this ban, and he even made it punishable by death if a book in Arabic was published in the Ottoman land. So that was an enormous, unfortunate reversal of attitude towards knowledge and new technology, and definitely it was one of the factors why Muslim world fell behind compared to Europe. And so, of course, the reign of Sultan Süleyman, we call him Kanuni Sultan Süleyman in Turkish, who ruled the longest time among all Ottoman sultans for 46 years. So his reign is considered to be the peak of Ottoman power, right? So, however, in reality, Ottomans and the Muslim world was already falling behind in scientific progress by that time. However, it did not become clear to them at the time. Ottomans were thought that they were the superpower of the world. However, they were falling behind. It was deceptive, right? The power was deceiving to them and to the Muslim world more generally. By the time they realized that they are behind Europeans, it was a little too late, And Ottomans were not poor. They did have wealth, but their scientific progress in Islamic world, in Ottomans in particular, was not proportional to its wealth. So Ottomans perhaps were more interested in military power and political power, but unfortunately not so much on scientific research and philosophy and so forth. So you see, Ottomans were really slow to adopt this printing press. It was finally allowed in 18th century, but in a very limited way, right? So they allowed books by non-Muslims and not in Arabic, right? So they did not want religious books or books in Arabic to be published using printing press. So that was really unfortunate. So the first printing press was in the Muslim world was in Egypt at the end of 18th century. And by that time, there was a huge gap in literacy rates between Europe and the Ottomans. So Europeans were much more literate compared to Ottomans. So we cannot put all the blames to the external factors. I think these internal factors were more as equally important, if not more important and decisive. So, this looking at the Muslim world in terms of political and religious events is very common in the Muslim world as well, right? So we glorify the reign of Sultan Süleyman, but we hardly acknowledge that Muslim world was falling behind already in scientific progress at that time. We need to be more objective about this point. And another example of the reversal of attitude towards knowledge, An important observatory was established in Istanbul in 1577 called Taqiyuddin Observatory, but it was destroyed only 3 years after it was built, For whatever reason, I don't have time to go into the reasons behind it, but Sultan III used a fatwa, which is using a fatwa, which was a religious opinion issued by a religious authority. So he just used that fatwa to destroy it. This is a complete reversal, because observatory as a scientific institution was born and developed in the Islamic world, right, in earlier centuries. But by the end of 16th century, we were destroying it. So by the highest authorities in the land, these scientific institutions, which were so important to scientific activities in the Muslim world, they were being destroyed now by the end of 16th century. So this is a real reversal from the earlier attitude in the Muslim world that led to great progress. So these, in my opinion, these factors are probably more important and decisive than those external reasons. Okay, now, so we can perhaps explain the age of decline in terms of these reasons, but that doesn't explain why these enormous contributions from the Muslim world were forgotten, not just in the West, by Muslims themselves. Growing up in a Muslim world, I never learned of these profound contributions to math and sciences by the Muslim scholars, and it is a very common situation, right? By and large, these contributions are really forgotten, and even people who know something about these, it is in general terms and in a vague way, not really specifics. So why is it that these profound contributions to math and sciences from the Islamic world, why were they forgotten? These reasons that we talk about so far, they don't really explain this situation. Well, I think the reason for that was colonial powers imposing a certain point of view, right? So remember, starting 18th century, Europeans colonized much of the world, including much of the Muslim world, right? And they imposed certain worldview on their subjects, and they argue that Europeans are superior because of their science, right? And the rest of the world is like inferior in terms of scientific progress. And so Muslim world, under that colonial ruling, it was really a shock, right? Imagine going from being a superpower of the world to being colonized by Europeans. That was really shocking for the Muslim world, and it came with a lot of, negative impacts and search for an explanation, to explain all of that unfortunate events. There is a saying that history is written by winners, and that was unfortunately the case, right? So the winners, the Europeans, wrote the history the way they wanted. They wanted to paint a picture where Europeans are superior due to their science, and the rest of the world is not capable of producing a brilliant science as Europeans. The brilliance in science, according to this point of view, belong to the West. If you go to ancient times, it is Greeks and then Europeans, right? So the the classical narrative mindset goes back to this colonial point of view, right? So the West is superior due to its science, right? And the roots of that science goes back to Greeks and then Renaissance. So that became the common narrative. And under this narrative, the significance of Islamic contributions to science was neglected, forgotten or overlooked. So, so that dominant, point of view for a few centuries caused even the Muslim world to forget about its own history. And even now, in recent decades, there has been progress, but that progress, has not been enough. It was not enough to fully discover the real contributions of Islamic civilization, and there is still a huge lack of research in this field, and things are only found in bits and pieces, and the large dominant narrative has still been around, so much more, much greater effort is needed to tell the full story, and to replace this distorted classical narrative, which is Eurocentric and which was based on certain ideology, which is really superiority of the Western world. So that means, we have a lot of homework to do, right? So first of all, we need to learn the history as accurately as and objectively as possible, without exaggerations, right? I mean, based on actual evidence. And again, much research is still needed on this topic. There is still a lot of original manuscripts that are waiting to be studied by scholars. And it is so unfortunate that these manuscripts that are sitting in the Muslim world, they are not being studied, by Muslim scholars. And many of the researchers in this field are ironically Western researchers. And it was Western researchers who discovered these connections between medieval Islamic scholars and Renaissance scientists. So again, we have a duty now to support research in this field by any means that you can. If you're a young person looking for a field of study, perhaps you should consider, doing research in this field, at least to learn more about it. And if you are an established person, perhaps you can, support activities in this field. And also, I also want to make the point that the only reason for learning higher, acquiring higher levels of learning and education should not be worldly gains like a position, a career, fame, or wealth, right? Yes, these things are part of the life and it's part of the reality, but remember, there are more noble causes for learning and doing research. And so if we go back to the very first lecture, so remember, with the right attitude and point of view and teachings of the Quran, acquiring knowledge and studying what's going on in the universe and the natural world is actually a form of worship and a way to get closer to God. So remember, there are two kinds of ayat, right? There are ayats of the Quran and there are ayats in the universe. And the Quran invites us to study both of these. And there is, there is a point in the fact that, behind the fact that it is the same word that is used for the verses of the Quran and the signs of God in the universe. So both of these things are important and significant and worthy of study and our time. So, these days, it is very common in the Muslim community to have a higher education because, you get a position and a career and a good paying job. I'm not saying that these things are not important, but I would like to suggest that that should not be the only reason to learn higher levels of knowledge. There is also other reasons to learn pure knowledge, not necessarily for these worldly, gains. So, so I think there is a lot of things that we can learn from history and the teachings of the Quran. I mean, we really need to go back and think deeply about, what the Quran is and why the Quran is urging us so much to acquire knowledge and to learn about the natural world. And I would like to, in particular, highlight this liberal arts model that is unique to the American higher education system, right? So in this model, the disciplines or departments that are directly related to a career and jobs, they are deliberately not part of a liberal arts education model. So instead, it focuses on more fundamental disciplines like natural sciences, mathematics, biology, chemistry, biology, and humanities, and social sciences and fine arts, right? And so this model really, it is unique to American higher education system, but it is practically not known in the Muslim world as well, at all, right? So I would like to propose that Muslim world should really consider this model because it fits really well with the teachings of Islam and its emphasis on pure knowledge, right? So the only reason, or even the main reason of acquiring knowledge should not be just in terms of jobs, right? I mean, in terms of creating, obtaining a high-paying job. So nowadays, a lot of Muslim families are interested in, their kids becoming doctors or engineers, right? Because they pay well and you are guaranteed to have a good paying job. There is nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, at least some people in the community should be interested in these pure knowledge, right? The disciplines that are represented in liberal arts, including arts, by the way, right? I mean, fine arts, we also need people interested in fine arts. We cannot have only doctors and engineers in the community. We also need artists and philosophers and historians and so forth, right? So, again, growing up a Muslim majority country, I can tell, and I think most of us can tell that, Muslim community is more interested in these fields, right? And also at the larger scale, a lot of Muslim countries are interested in transferring technology, like for quick transformation, but without an infrastructure to support and sustain scientific activities in the long term, we are not going to be successful in the long term. You see, we need to really think more deeply and more systematically and longer term, and we should really invest in infrastructure and basic, foundational matters for long-term success. So, I mean, these are some of the things, ideas that I would like to propose, and I would like us to consider. Okay, and another duty that we have is to help disseminate this accurate information and try to get this material represented in school curriculum. By and large, students these days do not learn about Muslim world. Even if they do, they only learn about religion and politics and wars, not anything about intellectual achievements of Muslim world, right? So I know this firsthand. I'm a first-hand witness of this from my own kids, right? Even when this material is officially part of the school curriculum, I saw in my own kids' school that it was totally omitted, skipped. Teacher simply skipped that altogether, and my kids learned about Greeks, everything about Greeks all year long, and they learned nothing about the Islamic world, And I think this is a very common situation, right? So, and even when it is officially in the curriculum, it is not necessarily being taught by teachers or schools, and it is our duty to make sure that this material gets into school curriculum, and we need to talk to teachers and administrators to about this. And I'm doing my best to help with this cause, and we just produced, as I mentioned last time, a fresh set of digital materials that can be used in classrooms. So if you look at this link, you will see these materials, and I really hope that it will help with this cause. Okay, I think it is now time to have the quiz. So the question is, who do you think is my favorite medieval Islamic scholar? Is it Ömer Khayyam, whose view of algebra became so huge in modern mathematics? Is it Al-Kashi, whose book I have been translating for the last several years? The first volume has been published. Second and third should be coming soon. Is it Ibn al-Haytham, who was the father of optics and pioneer in scientific method, one of the giants of Islamic science, Islamic scholars? Is it Al-Khawarizmi, who wrote the first algebra book in history in Baghdad, in House of Wisdom? Or is it Al-Tusi, whose work directly influenced Copernicus, and Copernicus just directly used his theorem, the Tusi-couple theorem, even to the point of labeling the points in the geometric figure. So who do you think would be my favorite scholar? Of course, this is a subjective question, right? Okay, well, let's see. Oh, okay. So it is Al-Khawarizmi. So why do you think that is? Well, the reason is that algebra and algorithm, remember the term algorithm comes from his name, right? It is just the modification of his name. So algebra and algorithm are so fundamental in modern science in general, and in particular my own research in mathematics based on algebra and algorithms. So specifically for my research, algorithm and algebra are so fundamental that he is my favorite Islamic scholar. And of course, all of these scholars and many others, they have they have huge place in the history of science. They are not inferior to more famous European scholars, but we need to do more work to teach about their contributions to more general population, and perhaps starting with ourselves, right? So our very first homework is actually to educate ourselves on this topic. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation for today, and this was the last session. So thank you all for joining us, and those who couldn't join tonight, I hope you'll be able to watch the recording later and share it with other people, and particularly, once again, the materials that we produce, I hope they will be useful for you, for your kids, for your colleagues, teachers that you know. So please help promote these materials, and they are based on, these materials based on academic research on primary sources, right? So it is not based on assumptions or prejudice or ideology. This is simply trying to disseminate established academic research based on primary sources. Okay, thank you for your attention. If there happens to be any questions, I would like to entertain them. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Aydin, for this wonderful presentation. We got two questions. One of them is how important is giving credit to the right people in history, and how can we, as new information is found, properly correct them, especially in history classes at schools?
So what was the second one?
How can we, as new information is found, properly correct them, especially in history classes at schools?
Well, by referring to the actual research, right? I mean, so the first question was, how important it is. I mean, some people may, have the attitude that, this is history, it is all gone, it is all past, what is the big deal, right? Some people have this attitude. But the thing is, though, based on these attributions and misattributions, there is a larger narrative going on, you see? So that is the real problem. You see, there is a larger narrative going on based on distorted narrative and misattribution. So, you may think that, an accurate attribution is not a big deal necessarily, but it turns out that there are larger, there is a larger narrative going on in which Islamic world is portrayed in a much different way. So that will help, correct this narrative that is really damaging, and not helpful, right? And in the extreme way, it leads to the idea of clash of civilizations. Clash of civilization is not something that we need. And if you actually look at the scholars, they learn from each other. Scholars from different cultures and civilizations, they learn from each other, right? So Muslims learn from Indians and Greeks and Persians, and Europeans learn from Muslims, right? So there was not a clash between scholars. They learn from each other, and this so-called Western civilization is actually a common, heritage of humanity. The shared heritage of humanity to which all kinds of civilizations contributed. So, in the grand scheme of things, it is very important, to give credit when it is due, and it is an important way, I think, to fight this, divisive discourse that portrays the Muslim world as the other, as the enemy. But we look at the facts, it is intimately connected to the creation of the modern world. So how can we get the second question was, how can we give proper credit? I think by just being knowledgeable about it and doing our part in spreading the information. So yeah.
Thanks so much for this answer, Dr. Aydin. Another question comes: do you anticipate any promising advancement for the Muslim world in science in the near future? What do you see as a scientist yourself?
Yes, I'm not a pessimistic person, right? I'm optimistic, but at the same time realistic. It was definitely done before, and with the right attitude and investment, it can be done, and I hope it will happen again. Of course, we cannot know what will happen in future, and I would like to believe that it will happen again, and I'm trying to do my best to contribute to this effect, right? And all of us should do the same, right? So there are some things in the world that we cannot control, but there are other things that we do control, that we can control, and I propose that we focus on the things that we can control and make a difference about, right? So, if you only look at the larger events in the world that you cannot control, it can lead to pessimism. But I would like to suggest that let's all of us do our very best, to make a positive change in the world, and that's it, right? That's all that we can do, right?
Well, thank you, Dr. Aydin, for this wonderful answer too, and I'd like to thank you and Dr. Gürsen for initiating this project in this 5-part series of Islam and science. I hope this will serve as a wonderful archive on the World Wide Web, on YouTube, on the Islamic Center's, Salam Islamic Center's YouTube channel. And any last words, please?
Yeah, so I would welcome any input from the audience, right? So, just like the early Islamic scholars that exhibited the questioning, critical mind, so please, examine what I've been saying, in these lectures, and if you have any opinions, or if you think that I'm mistaken, definitely, I can definitely be mistaken, right? So even the greatest minds in history, in a lot of times they turn out to be wrong, right? Not accurate. So please examine this material with a critical mind and send me feedback, positive or negative, critical or not. So I would like to keep in touch, and we advance and we learn new things by this attitude of being critical for the purpose of advancement, right? So please write to me about anything related to these matters, and thank you for your interest. Yeah, we lost the audio.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Aydin, and also Dr. Gürsen for initiating this project. We're looking forward to having you in another project too. And thanks to our audience for watching this.
And again, the final thank for the Salam Islamic Center for organizing this event. And this helped me organize my thoughts as well. And thank you.